The biting wind, a phantom hand from the north, whipped across the muddy fields near Eoforwick, the Saxon name for York. It carried with it the stench of fear and the grim promise of blood. Dawn was a bruised, reluctant thing, painting the eastern sky in shades of charcoal and dying embers. Below, two vast armies faced each other, a tableau of impending carnage etched against the gray canvas of a northern autumn. On one side, the disciplined, mail-clad ranks of the Anglo-Saxons, their shields locked in a formidable wall, the very embodiment of King Ethelred's desperate defense. They stood firm, a bulwark of bone, steel, and desperation, their faces grim masks of duty and foreboding. They believed in their strength, their numbers, their king's authority. They believed in the solidity of their shield wall, a living, breathing fortress that had repelled countless assaults. But on the other side, a different kind of storm was gathering. The Vikings, not the raiders of legend, but an organized, determined invasion force, a sea of furs, leather, and gleaming iron, their hearts filled with the icy resolve of men who had sailed from the edge of the world to claim what they believed was theirs, by right of conquest. Their war cries, a guttural symphony of rage and defiance, began to rise, a chilling counterpoint to the anxious murmur of the Saxon ranks. This was not a mere raid. This was a declaration of war, a seismic shift in the balance of power that had held sway over these islands for generations. The air thrummed with an almost unbearable tension, the silence before the thunderclap of battle. The fate of a kingdom, the very soul of England, hung precariously in the balance, poised on the edge of this blood-soaked plain. The Saxons, confident in their established martial traditions, saw only a brutal, head-on confrontation, a test of endurance and brute force. They were prepared for the clash of swords, the splintering of shields, the desperate struggle for inches of blood-soaked earth. They had trained for this, lived for this, their entire societal structure built around the defense of hearth and home. Their king, Ethelred, had gathered his finest warriors, his most trusted earls, all united under the banner of St. Edmund, a symbol of defiant martyrdom. They were the defenders, the established order, and they saw the Vikings as a barbaric tide to be pushed back, a temporary storm to be weathered. Their strength lay in their formation, the legendary shield wall, a seemingly impenetrable barrier of interlocking shields, spears bristling like a hedgehog's quills, and the unwavering resolve of men fighting for their land, their families, and their faith. This was the cornerstone of Saxon warfare, a tactic honed over centuries of conflict, designed to absorb the shock of any assault and grind down the enemy through sheer attrition and disciplined resilience. They expected a battle of attrition, a bloody grinding of metal against metal, a test of who would break first. They believed their heavy armor, their disciplined formations, and their sheer numbers would be enough to repel the northern invaders. They were wrong, for lurking within the ranks of the great heathen army, beyond the brute force of berserkers and the seasoned skill of their huscarls, was a weapon, a strategy, a subtle yet devastating force that would shatter the Saxon confidence and rewrite the history of this island. It was not a single gleaming blade of myth, nor a magical incantation whispered on the wind. It was something far more insidious, a calculated exploitation of the very strengths that the Saxons held dear, a secret that would turn their proud shield wall into a tomb. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the annals of warfare, a battle where ancient tactics met a brutal yet surprisingly sophisticated innovation. The air crackled with the unspoken, the unseen, the promise of a secret that would soon be revealed in a torrent of blood and steel, forever altering the course of English history. The fate of Eoforwick, and indeed of England itself, rested on the outcome of this clash, a clash where the traditional might of the Saxons would be pitted against a devastating, and until now, largely unacknowledged, Viking ingenuity. The winds of change carried on the longships were about to blow with hurricane force. The echoes of the approaching battle were already a symphony of distant drums and war horns, a prelude to a dawn that would witness not just a victory, but a profound and brutal lesson in the art of war. The world held its breath, unaware of the subtle yet seismic shift about to occur on this windswept plain. The great heathen army, a force that had stormed across the North Sea with the fury of a tempest, was not merely a disorganized horde of bloodthirsty warriors. It was a sophisticated military machine, forged in the crucible of Scandinavian tribal warfare, and honed by years of successful campaigns across the British Isles and continental Europe. At its heart were the Viking chieftains, men of immense charisma and battlefield acumen, men like Ivar the Boneless, Ubba, and Guthrum, who understood not just the ferocity of their warriors, but the strategic necessity of overwhelming their enemies with a coordinated assault that exploited every weakness. They were the architects of a new era of warfare, one that blended the raw power of their warriors with a cunning understanding of their opponent's strengths and vulnerabilities. The Vikings were masters of the sea, their longships not merely vessels of transport but mobile fortresses, allowing them to strike with speed and surprise, appearing from the mist-shrouded horizons to unleash their fury upon unsuspecting coastal settlements. But their prowess extended far beyond naval dominance. On land they were formidable adversaries, their warriors often clad in mail shirts, conical helmets, and wielding an array of deadly weapons. The iconic Dane axe, a fearsome weapon with a broad, heavy blade capable of cleaving through shields and armor with a single brutal swing, was a symbol of their martial might. Its weight and reach gave Viking warriors a distinct advantage in close combat, allowing them to dominate the melee. Alongside the axe, they employed swords, spears, and bows, each weapon wielded with deadly proficiency. However, their true strength lay not in individual weaponry, but in their cohesive fighting style. While often depicted as individualistic berserkers, Viking armies fought in formations, often a dense mass of warriors that, while perhaps less rigidly structured than the Saxon shieldwall, was designed to overwhelm with sheer momentum and ferocity. They understood the psychological impact of their appearance, their war paint, their war cries, and the sheer terror they could inspire. They were a force of nature, relentless and unyielding, driven by a potent blend of ambition, the pursuit of wealth, and a fierce warrior code that valued honor and glory above all else. Their presence in England was not new, but the scale and intent of the Great Heathen Army in 793 AD, following the devastating raid on Lindisfarne, marked a significant escalation. This was no longer about opportunistic plunder. This was a systematic invasion, a concerted effort to conquer and settle. They had already carved out significant territories, their influence spreading like an insidious vine. The tensions leading up to the Battle of Eoforwick were the culmination of decades of such incursions, a simmering conflict that had finally boiled over. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, fragmented and often squabbling amongst themselves, found themselves increasingly unable to present a united front against this relentless northern onslaught. King Ethelred of Northumbria, a kingdom already weakened by internal strife and previous Viking attacks, found himself facing an existential threat. The Great Heathen Army, under the command of formidable leaders, had established a foothold, and their sights were firmly set on the strategically vital city of Eoforwick. The Saxon response, therefore, was not merely a defensive maneuver, it was a desperate gamble, a last stand by a kingdom teetering on the brink of collapse. They gathered their forces, their finest warriors, their most experienced earls, all united by a shared sense of duty and the grim determination to defend their homeland from utter annihilation. They understood the stakes, the potential for their kingdom, their culture, their very way of life, to be swept away by the tide of the Viking invasion. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of both armies, a battle where the fate of England would be decided not just by the clash of steel, but by the cunning of war. The Northumbrian army, a formidable force in its own right, was composed primarily of thanes, retinues, and ceorls, the freemen who formed the backbone of the Saxon military. They were warriors of experience, trained from a young age in the arts of combat, their lives intertwined with the defense of their lords and their kingdom. Their primary tactic, as mentioned, was the shieldwall. This was a formation that maximized their defensive capabilities, creating a living, breathing fortress that was incredibly difficult to breach. Shields, typically round and made of wood reinforced with leather and a metal boss, were interlocked tightly, forming an unbroken line. Spears were thrust through the gaps, creating a bristling hedge of points. Behind this front line, more warriors stood ready to reinforce any weak points or to counterattack. The effectiveness of the shield wall lay in its discipline and its ability to absorb the shock of an enemy charge. It was designed to negate the impact of cavalry charges and to withstand the initial onslaught of infantry. It was a tactic that relied on cohesion, on the individual warrior trusting the man beside him, and on the collective will to hold the line. They were also well equipped with mail shirts, helmets, and swords for the wealthier warriors, while many carried spears and axes. Their close-quarters combat was brutal and effective, a testament to their martial training and their fierce determination to defend their homes. However, this very strength, this reliance on a static, disciplined formation, also contained the seeds of its own destruction. The shield wall, while formidable, was vulnerable to specific types of assault. It required space to maneuver and to maintain its integrity. It was susceptible to flanking maneuvers, to being outflanked and attacked from the rear. Moreover, it was a formation that was inherently defensive, designed to repel rather than to initiate decisive offensive action. Its strength was its rigidity, but this rigidity could also become a fatal flaw when faced with an enemy who understood how to exploit it. The Saxons, in their preparations for the inevitable clash, believed they had accounted for every eventuality. They had gathered their forces, bolstered their defenses, and positioned themselves to meet the Viking onslaught head-on, confident in the proven efficacy of their shield wall. They were ready for a battle of attrition, a test of endurance and brute force. They expected the Vikings to charge, to break themselves against the unyielding wall of Saxon steel. They were about to learn that the Vikings had brought more than just brute force to this fight. They had brought a secret, a weapon that would shatter their carefully constructed defenses and reveal the hidden vulnerabilities of their most cherished tactic. The winds of fate were about to shift, and the fate of Eoforwick, and indeed the future of England, would be decided by a tactic that few foresaw, a testament to the ever-evolving nature of warfare. The air was thick with the unspoken, the anticipation of a brutal, decisive clash, a clash where the established order would be challenged by a force that understood the subtle art of war as much as the art of brute strength. The Saxon shield wall stood ready, a symbol of their proud heritage, unaware of the storm that was about to break it. The Saxon army, arrayed in their imposing shield wall, represented a military philosophy deeply ingrained in their culture, a steadfast defense built upon collective discipline and the strength of their heavily armored infantry. Their primary offensive capability stemmed from the sheer weight of their formation, a slow, inexorable advance designed to crush enemy lines through sustained pressure and the devastating impact of their spears and axes in close-quarters combat. Each warrior was a cog in a formidable machine, their individual bravery subsumed by the unit's integrity. However, this very reliance on a rigid, unified front created a critical vulnerability, a susceptibility to disruption from unexpected angles or through methods that bypassed the direct impact of their shield-to-shield confrontation. Their training emphasized holding the line, absorbing blows, and pressing forward methodically. They were prepared for a direct frontal assault, a test of endurance where their superior discipline and resilience would, they believed, eventually wear down the more chaotic Viking charge. The Saxon military structure, with its emphasis on thegns leading their retinues, fostered a strong sense of loyalty and cohesion within smaller units, but it could also lead to a degree of inflexibility when faced with novel battlefield tactics. Their armor, while effective against direct blows, offered less protection against projectiles or attacks that targeted the gaps between shields or the vulnerabilities of the legs and feet. Furthermore, the psychological impact of a sustained, coordinated assault that didn't adhere to the expected patterns of warfare could be devastating, eroding the confidence that underpinned the shield wall's effectiveness. Now, consider how this applies when you face an opponent whose entire strategy is built around maintaining an unbroken, unyielding front. What happens when that front is subjected to a force that doesn't simply batter against it, but systematically seeks to dismantle its structural integrity, not through brute force alone, but through a calculated application of pressure and a profound understanding of its inherent weaknesses? The Saxons were masters of their own domain, their tactics honed over generations of conflict against similar adversaries. They understood the ebb and flow of a direct engagement. What they perhaps underestimated was the Viking capacity for innovation, their willingness to adapt and employ strategies that were, for the Saxons, entirely foreign and unsettling. Their reliance on the shield wall meant that any successful breach, any significant disruption to that unbroken line, could have cascading and catastrophic consequences, turning a formidable defense into a disorganized rout. The psychological advantage gained by the Vikings through such disruption cannot be overstated. It was a weapon as potent as any steel. The very formation that provided them with strength, also became their Achilles' heel when confronted by a foe who understood its limitations. The Vikings, however, possessed a tactical sophistication that often went unrecognized by their more settled adversaries. While the Danax and the ferocity of their warriors are legendary, their true battlefield genius lay in their adaptability and their understanding of how to exploit an enemy's weaknesses. The Battle of Eoforwick was not simply about a head-on collision. It was about a calculated strategy designed to dismantle the Saxon shield wall from within its own perceived strengths. The Saxons, in their confidence, had arrayed their army in a formidable, unbroken line, a testament to their martial tradition. They expected a direct assault, a test of brute strength and endurance. What they were not prepared for was a tactic that leveraged their own rigid formation against them, a method that didn't just batter the wall, but systematically undermined its structural integrity. The key lay in the concept of the feared, the Saxon levy, which, while composed of brave men, often lacked the professional training and equipment of the Viking herdmen or berserkers. Furthermore, the Saxon army, while large, was not a monolithic entity. It was composed of various regional levies, each with its own commanders and differing levels of experience. This fragmentation, while not immediately apparent in the tight-packed shield wall, could be exploited. The Vikings understood that a shield wall's strength was its continuity. A single gap, a moment of hesitation, or a forced movement could create a ripple effect, causing the entire formation to buckle. Their innovation was not a single new weapon, but a devastatingly effective application of existing capabilities, amplified by a profound understanding of battlefield psychology. They employed a tactic that, while not explicitly named in surviving texts with the same clarity as a shield wall, is evident in the consequences of battles like Eoforwick. This involved a feigned retreat, a tactic designed to draw out sections of the disciplined Saxon line, breaking its cohesion. This was not a panicked flight, but a calculated maneuver, a lure. The Vikings would engage the shield wall, then appear to falter, falling back in apparent disarray. This was the moment of supreme temptation for the Saxons. Their instinct was to press their advantage, to pursue the retreating foe, and shatter their formation. They would break ranks, eager to exploit what they perceived as a weakness, to turn the tide through a decisive charge. However, this was precisely what the Vikings intended. As the Saxon warriors, in their eagerness, stepped out of the protective embrace of the shield wall, they became isolated. The feigned retreat would often lead them into prearranged killing grounds, where Viking reserves, hidden from view, would surge forward, or where the retreating Vikings would wheel around, attacking the now exposed flanks and rear of the pursuing Saxons. This tactic, when executed flawlessly, created chaos within the Saxon ranks. The unbroken wall would fracture, and the disciplined cohesion that was their greatest strength would dissolve into a desperate, individual struggle for survival. The psychological impact of seeing their comrades fall, of being surrounded and cut off, was immense, shattering the morale that held the shield wall together. It was a brutal lesson in the fact that a static defense, however strong, could be undone by an opponent who understood the dynamics of movement, deception, and psychological warfare. The Saxon army was a fortress, but the Vikings found the key to unlock its gates not by brute force but by cunning and a deep understanding of their enemy's psychology. The very discipline that made the Saxon shield wall so formidable also made it predictable and ultimately vulnerable to this calculated deception. It was a strategy that turned the Saxons' greatest strength into their most profound weakness, a testament to the evolving nature of warfare and the devastating impact of strategic innovation. The battle was not just a clash of arms, it was a clash of philosophies, where adaptability and deception triumphed over rigid adherence to tradition. The Saxon army, arrayed in their imposing shield wall, represented a military philosophy deeply ingrained in their culture, a steadfast defense built upon collective discipline and the strength of their heavily armored infantry. Their primary offensive capability stemmed from the sheer weight of their formation, a slow, inexorable advance designed to crush enemy lines through sustained pressure and the devastating impact of their spears and axes in close-quarters combat. Each warrior was a cog in a formidable machine, their individual bravery subsumed by the unit's integrity. However, this very reliance on a rigid, unified front created a critical vulnerability, a susceptibility to disruption from unexpected angles or through methods that bypassed the direct impact of their shield-to-shield confrontation. Their training emphasized holding the line, absorbing blows and pressing forward methodically. They were prepared for a direct frontal assault, a test of endurance where their superior discipline and resilience would, they believed, eventually wear down the more chaotic Viking charge. The Saxon military structure, with its emphasis on thens leading their retinues, fostered a strong sense of loyalty and cohesion within smaller units, but it could also lead to a degree of inflexibility when faced with novel battlefield tactics. Their armor, while effective against direct blows, offered less protection against projectiles or attacks that targeted the gaps between shields or the vulnerabilities of the legs and feet. Furthermore, the psychological impact of a sustained, coordinated assault that didn't adhere to the expected patterns of warfare could be devastating, eroding the confidence that underpinned the shield wall's effectiveness. Now, consider how this applies when you face an opponent whose entire strategy is built around maintaining an unbroken, unyielding front. What happens when that front is subjected to a force that doesn't simply batter against it, but systematically seeks to dismantle its structural integrity, not through brute force alone, but through a calculated application of pressure and a profound understanding of its inherent weaknesses? The Saxons were masters of their own domain, their tactics honed over generations of conflict against similar adversaries. They understood the ebb and flow of a direct engagement. What they perhaps underestimated was the Viking capacity for innovation, their willingness to adapt and employ strategies that were, for the Saxons, entirely foreign and unsettling. Their reliance on the shield wall meant that any successful breach, any significant disruption to that unbroken line, could have cascading and catastrophic consequences, turning a formidable defense into a disorganized rout. The psychological advantage gained by the Vikings through such disruption cannot be overstated. It was a weapon as potent as any steel. The very formation that provided them with strength also became their Achilles' heel when confronted by a foe who understood its limitations. The Vikings, however, possessed a tactical sophistication that often went unrecognized by their more settled adversaries. While the Danax and the ferocity of their warriors are legendary, their true battlefield genius lay in their adaptability and their understanding of how to exploit an enemy's weaknesses. The Battle of Eoforwick was not simply about a head-on collision. It was about a calculated strategy designed to dismantle the Saxon shield wall from within its own perceived strengths. The Saxons, in their confidence, had arrayed their army in a formidable, unbroken line, a testament to their martial tradition. They expected a direct assault, a test of brute strength and endurance. What they were not prepared for was a tactic that leveraged their own rigid formation against them, a method that didn't just batter the wall, but systematically undermined its structural integrity. The key lay in the concept of the feared, the Saxon levy, which, while composed of brave men, often lacked the professional training and equipment of the Viking herdmen or berserkers. Furthermore, the Saxon army, while large, was not a monolithic entity. It was composed of various regional levies, each with its own commanders and differing levels of experience. This fragmentation, while not immediately apparent in the tight-packed shield wall, could be exploited. The Vikings understood that a shield wall's strength was its continuity. A single gap, a moment of hesitation, or a forced movement could create a ripple effect, causing the entire formation to buckle. Their innovation was not a single new weapon, but a devastatingly effective application of existing capabilities, amplified by a profound understanding of battlefield psychology. They employed a tactic that, while not explicitly named in surviving texts with the same clarity as a shield wall, is evident in the consequences of battles like Eoforwick. This involved a feigned retreat, a tactic designed to draw out sections of the disciplined Saxon line, breaking its cohesion. This was not a panicked flight, but a calculated maneuver, a lure. The Vikings would engage the shield wall, then appear to falter, falling back in apparent disarray. This was the moment of supreme temptation for the Saxons. Their instinct was to press their advantage, to pursue the retreating foe, and shatter their formation. They would break ranks, eager to exploit what they perceived as a weakness, to turn the tide through a decisive charge. However, this was precisely what the Vikings intended. As the Saxon warriors, in their eagerness, stepped out of the protective embrace of the shield wall, they became isolated. The feigned retreat would often lead them into prearranged killing grounds, where Viking reserves, hidden from view, would surge forward, or where the retreating Vikings would wheel around, attacking the now exposed flanks and rear of the pursuing Saxons. This tactic, when executed flawlessly, created chaos within the Saxon ranks. The unbroken wall would fracture, and the disciplined cohesion that was their greatest strength would dissolve into a desperate, individual struggle for survival. The psychological impact of seeing their comrades fall, of being surrounded and cut off, was immense, shattering the morale that held the shield wall together. It was a brutal lesson in the fact that a static defense, however strong, could be undone by an opponent who understood the dynamics of movement, deception, and psychological warfare. The Saxon army was a fortress, but the Vikings found the key to unlock its gates not by brute force but by cunning and a deep understanding of their enemy's psychology. The very discipline that made the Saxon shield wall so formidable also made it predictable and ultimately vulnerable to this calculated deception. It was a strategy that turned the Saxons' greatest strength into their most profound weakness, a testament to the evolving nature of warfare and the devastating impact of strategic innovation. The battle was not just a clash of arms, it was a clash of philosophies, where adaptability and deception triumphed over rigid adherence to tradition. The turning point at Eoforwick was not a single thunderous charge, but a meticulously orchestrated dismantling of the Saxon bulwark. While the feigned retreat was the bait, the true secret weapon was the Vikings' mastery of flanking maneuvers and their ruthless exploitation of the Saxon army's inherent rigidity. Imagine the shield wall, a solid line of determined men. The Vikings, instead of massing for a direct frontal assault, began to probe its edges. Small, highly mobile units of warriors, often equipped with lighter armor for speed, would launch swift, harassing attacks against the flanks of the Saxon formation. These weren't intended to break through, but to draw the attention and commitment of Saxon reserves, creating localized concentrations of force that, by their very nature, thinned out other parts of the line. Think of it like a skilled surgeon making a series of small incisions to isolate and then excise a tumor, rather than a bludgeon attempting to smash it. This constant pressure on the extremities served a dual purpose. It stretched the Saxon command's resources thin, forcing them to divert fighters from the main engagement, and it created psychological stress. The warriors on the flanks, facing constant, unpredictable attacks, would begin to feel exposed, their confidence eroding as they realized the shield wall's unbroken appearance was being subtly compromised. Furthermore, the Vikings understood the terrain's influence. If a slight rise or a patch of uneven ground existed, they would maneuver to gain a positional advantage, forcing the Saxons to either advance into a less advantageous position or to leave a flank exposed to secure their current ground. This wasn't about a single heroic act, but a relentless, intelligent application of pressure, a systematic erosion of the Saxons' ability to maintain their formidable, yet ultimately inflexible formation. The feigned retreat, when it came, was the culmination of this strategy. It wasn't a random act of desperation, but a calculated move to exploit the very openings created by these flanking probes. The Saxons, seeing what they believed to be a broken enemy, surged forward, their discipline momentarily overridden by the primal instinct to pursue and destroy. This pursuit, however, was not into open ground where they could maintain their formation, but often into areas where Viking reserves previously concealed could emerge, or where the retreating Vikings could swiftly regroup and attack the now vulnerable, extended Saxon flanks. The shield wall, designed to withstand direct impact, was not equipped to deal with an enemy that could appear from multiple directions simultaneously, striking at its exposed sides and rear. Consider for a moment the psychological impact of such a tactic. The Saxon warrior, trained to trust the shield and spear of the man beside him, suddenly finds himself assailed from an unexpected direction. The cohesive unit begins to fragment, not through overwhelming force but through strategic disorientation. This is where the Vikings' understanding of battlefield psychology truly shone. They didn't just fight with steel, they fought with fear and confusion. The feigned retreat was the spark, but the flanking maneuvers were the kindling, creating a tinderbox of vulnerability. The Saxon army was a magnificent edifice built on the principle of unwavering solidity. However, this very solidity made it susceptible to a precisely targeted undermining. Imagine an ancient stone wall. It can withstand immense battering, but a skilled enemy might find a way to loosen the mortar between individual stones, causing a section to crumble, not from a direct blow, but from a subtle, internal failure. The Vikings employed this principle on a grand scale. They understood that by applying pressure to the edges, by creating uncertainty and forcing the Saxons to react defensively in localized areas, they could initiate a chain reaction. The Saxon command, faced with multiple threats, would be forced to make difficult choices, often committing their reserves to perceived critical points, thereby weakening other sectors. This constant reactive posture, this inability to dictate the flow of battle, was a subtle but devastating weapon. The Vikings, conversely, were dictating the engagement, forcing the Saxons to respond to their moves. The key was not just the flanking itself, but the coordination with the feigned retreat, creating a perfect storm of confusion and opportunity. The Saxon warriors, accustomed to facing a direct, predictable enemy, found themselves battling an opponent who seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing and disappearing, always striking at their weakest points. This constant, unpredictable pressure wore down not just their bodies, but their resolve, chipping away at the very foundation of their courage and discipline. The shield wall, their ultimate defense, became a trap, its very strength leading to its undoing when confronted by an enemy who understood how to exploit its inherent limitations through intelligent maneuver and psychological warfare. The battle became less about who could swing their axe the hardest, and more about who could think the fastest and adapt the quickest. The consequences of this tactical victory for the Vikings were profound and far-reaching, fundamentally altering the political landscape of Anglo-Saxon England. The Battle of Eoforwic, often seen as a pivotal moment, resulted in a catastrophic defeat for the Northumbrian forces. King Ethelred himself was slain in the fighting, a devastating blow to Saxon leadership and morale. His death, along with the decimation of his army, effectively shattered the organized resistance in Northumbria, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to Viking domination. The aftermath was not merely a military victory, it was a strategic conquest. The great heathen army, now with its primary opposition in the region neutralized, was able to consolidate its power. Eoforwic, renamed York, became a major Viking stronghold, a seat of power from which they could launch further campaigns and establish their governance. This was not just about territorial gains, it was about the imposition of a new order. The Anglo-Saxon social structures, the established hierarchies, and the very fabric of life in Northumbria were irrevocably disrupted. The Viking presence brought with it new laws, new customs, and a new ruling class. The long-term impact was the creation of the Danelaw, a vast swathe of England under Danish rule, a testament to the success of the Viking invasion and the effectiveness of their military strategies. The Battle of Eoforwic, therefore, was more than just a single bloody engagement. It was a catalyst that reshaped the destiny of England. It demonstrated the superiority of Viking tactical adaptability and their willingness to innovate on the battlefield, proving that sheer brute force, while important, was not enough. The ability to outmaneuver, to deceive, and to psychologically dismantle an enemy's resolve proved to be the decisive factor. The Saxon shield wall, a symbol of their enduring strength, ultimately buckled under the weight of a more sophisticated and adaptable approach to warfare. The echoes of this defeat resonated for generations, shaping the future of England and leaving an indelible mark on its history and its very identity. The victory at Eoforwic was not just a triumph of arms, it was a victory of strategic thinking, a brutal lesson in the ever-evolving nature of conflict. The consequences were a stark reminder that even the most formidable defenses can be overcome by an enemy who understands how to exploit their inherent weaknesses, a lesson etched in blood on the fields of Eoforwic. The age of Saxon dominance in the north was over, replaced by the iron fist of the Viking conquerors, a new era ushered in by a battle where cunning and adaptability had triumphed over tradition and brute force. The immediate aftermath of Eoforwic wasn't merely a cessation of hostilities, it was the violent birth of a new geopolitical reality, a seismic shift that rippled far beyond the blood-soaked fields. The Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, once a proud and powerful entity, was effectively decapitated. King Ethelred's demise left a leadership vacuum that the Vikings, under the shrewd command of figures like Ivar the Boneless and Ubba Ragnarsson, were quick to fill. This wasn't simply a matter of occupying territory, it was the systematic dismantling of existing power structures and the imposition of Viking authority. The city of Eoforwic, renamed York, transformed from a northern Saxon stronghold into the pulsating heart of Viking power in England. It became Jorvik, a center of administration, trade, and military operations, a base from which the great heathen army could project its influence further south and west. The strategic implications were immense. With Northumbria subdued, the path was open for further expansion, challenging the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and fundamentally altering the trajectory of English history. The very concept of England as a unified entity began to fragment, giving way to the reality of the Danelaw, a vast territory where Viking law, language, and culture held sway. This wasn't merely a change in rulers, it was a cultural and societal transformation. The social hierarchies, the land ownership patterns, and even the linguistic landscape of the affected regions were profoundly altered. New settlements were established, old ones were repurposed, and the integration, or often subjugation, of the native population began. The effectiveness of the Viking tactics, particularly the way they shattered the Saxon shieldwall through coordinated flanking and feigned retreats, had demonstrated a tactical superiority that the Saxons, mired in their traditional methods, struggled to counter. This military success wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern that would repeat itself across the Danelaw, solidifying Viking dominance. The long-term consequences were not just political, but deeply cultural. The linguistic intermingling, the introduction of new place names, and the enduring influence on English law and governance are all direct legacies of this period. The victory at Eoforwic wasn't merely a battle won, it was the successful execution of a grand strategy that fundamentally reshaped the island's destiny, ushering in an era where Viking influence became deeply interwoven with the nascent identity of England. The very landscape of power had been irrevocably altered. Furthermore, the impact of Eoforwic extended beyond the immediate military and political spheres, creating a profound psychological shift in the consciousness of the Anglo-Saxon populace. The seemingly invincible shield wall, a symbol of their martial pride and defensive might, had been broken not by sheer overwhelming force but by cunning and calculated deception. This revelation was deeply unsettling. It implied that their most trusted methods of warfare honed over centuries were not infallible. The confidence that underpinned their resistance was eroded, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. The fear of the Viking warrior, already considerable, was amplified by the understanding that these invaders possessed a strategic acumen that could outwit even their most disciplined formations. Consider the impact on the morale of a warrior who has always placed his faith in the man beside him, in the unbroken line of shields. When that line shatters due to a tactic he doesn't fully comprehend, a feigned retreat followed by a devastating flanking maneuver, it breeds a deep-seated sense of vulnerability. It's akin to a master craftsman discovering that his most trusted tool has a hidden flaw. This psychological blow was as significant as the physical losses. The Saxons were not just defeated, they were made to question their fundamental understanding of warfare. This insecurity would ripple through their subsequent defensive efforts, making them more hesitant, more prone to reactive rather than proactive strategies. The Vikings, conversely, gained an almost mythical reputation for their battlefield prowess, not just for their ferocity, but for their intelligence. This reputation itself became a weapon, a psychological advantage that preceded their physical arrival. The stories of their victories, embellished and retold, instilled fear and often despair in their enemies, predisposing them to crumble before the battle even truly began. The victory at Eoforwic, therefore, was a watershed moment not just in terms of military conquest but in the psychological subjugation of their opponents. It was a testament to the fact that in warfare, as in many aspects of life, perception and the erosion of an opponent's confidence can be as potent as any physical weapon. The Saxons learned a harsh lesson. A strong defense, without the capacity for adaptation and a clear understanding of the enemy's potential stratagems, could become a fatal liability. The psychological scars left by Eoforwic would influence Anglo-Saxon military thinking for years to come, a constant reminder of the day their most cherished defense was systematically dismantled. Building upon this, however, the long-term cultural and linguistic implications of Viking dominance, initiated by victories like Eoforwic, were far more intricate than a simple imposition of foreign rule. The establishment of the Danelaw, while initially a clear division of territory, led to a complex process of cultural intermingling and linguistic fusion that profoundly shaped the English language and identity. The Vikings, particularly in areas like Jorvik, didn't simply eradicate existing Anglo-Saxon culture. They integrated with it, albeit often from a position of power. This wasn't a one-way street of cultural absorption. Old Norse, the language of the Vikings, began to influence Old English, contributing thousands of words that are still in common use today. Words like sky, skin, leg, give, and take. The grammatical structures of English also underwent significant changes, influenced by the need for communication between two distinct language groups. This linguistic blending is a tangible legacy, a constant reminder of the Viking presence. Furthermore, the administrative and legal systems of the Danelaw introduced concepts and practices that differed from Anglo-Saxon traditions. While the Saxons had their own established laws, the Vikings brought their own customs, particularly concerning land tenure, trade, and dispute resolution. These systems, over time, were not entirely replaced but rather merged and adapted, contributing to the complex evolution of English common law. Think of it as two distinct streams of water flowing together, creating a new, richer current, rather than one simply overpowering the other. The settlement patterns also changed, with many areas seeing the establishment of Scandinavian-style villages and towns, further embedding Viking influence into the landscape. This wasn't just about conquest. It was about settlement and the creation of a new hybrid society. The children born in the Danelaw were often bilingual, their lives a testament to the ongoing interaction between the two cultures. Consequently, the England that eventually emerged from this period was not purely Anglo-Saxon, nor was it purely Viking. It was something new, a synthesis born from conflict and coexistence, a testament to the enduring power of cultural exchange, even when initiated by military might. The victory at Eoforwic, therefore, was not just the end of an era for the Saxons. It was the beginning of a new, complex chapter in the formation of England, a chapter written in both blood and the shared words of two peoples learning to live together. The cultural and linguistic fusion that followed the Viking victories, particularly the pivotal Battle of Eoforwic, introduced a fascinating layer of societal restructuring that went beyond mere military dominance. It wasn't simply about imposing a new set of rulers. It was about the practicalities of coexisting and governing a population with vastly different customs and languages. Consider the administrative challenges. How does a Viking earl, accustomed to the laws and traditions of Scandinavia, govern a populace that speaks a different tongue and adheres to existing Anglo-Saxon legal frameworks? The answer lay in a pragmatic blend of coercion and adaptation. Viking leaders, recognizing the need for stability and efficient governance, often retained existing Anglo-Saxon administrative structures and personnel where it served their purpose. Local reeves and officials, if they pledged loyalty and facilitated the collection of tribute, could continue their roles, albeit under Viking oversight. This pragmatic approach minimized immediate disruption and allowed the Vikings to consolidate their power more effectively, rather than attempting a complete overhaul that would inevitably breed widespread resistance. Furthermore, the very nature of Viking settlement, often involving the establishment of fortified towns like Jorvik, fostered a unique blend of cultures. These weren't merely military outposts, they became vibrant centers of trade and community. Here, Viking warriors, merchants, and artisans interacted daily with Anglo-Saxon farmers, laborers, and craftsmen. This constant proximity necessitated a practical bridging of linguistic divides. While Old Norse and Old English remained distinct for some time, a pidgin language, an early form of what would evolve into Middle English, began to emerge organically through necessity. This wasn't a formal decree. It was the natural consequence of people needing to communicate for trade, for daily life, and for resolving local disputes. The introduction of new landholding practices also significantly reshaped the social landscape. Viking concepts of land ownership and inheritance, which differed from the more hierarchical Anglo-Saxon system, began to be integrated. While the Viking elite certainly claimed vast tracts of land, the practicalities of farming and managing these territories often meant working with or reassigning land to the existing population. This led to a complex tapestry of land tenure, where elements of both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon traditions coexisted, creating a unique legal and social environment that would persist for centuries. Another crucial layer in this societal restructuring was the impact on the martial traditions themselves. While the Vikings brought their formidable fighting styles, the Anglo-Saxons, having endured prolonged periods of conflict and occupation, began to adapt. The resilience demonstrated by the Saxon shieldwall, even in defeat, was not entirely discarded. Instead, elements of both martial cultures began to influence each other. Viking warriors, in turn, might have learned new defensive formations or adopted certain Saxon weaponry and armor designs that proved effective. This mutual adaptation, born out of necessity and prolonged interaction, meant that the military landscape was not static, but continuously evolving. The influence extended into the realm of governance and law. The Vikings brought with them a system of law that emphasized community responsibility and dispute resolution through assemblies. While Anglo-Saxon law was already relatively sophisticated, the Viking approach introduced new nuances and procedures. The concept of the thing or thing, a public assembly for legal and political matters, became a significant feature in the Danelaw, fostering a sense of communal participation that, in some ways, differed from the more centralized authority of some Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This practical integration of legal and administrative systems was key to the long-term establishment of Viking rule, demonstrating a capacity for governance that went beyond mere military might. The intricate tapestry of the Danelaw was not merely woven from threads of conquest and governance, but also from the subtle yet pervasive influence on the very bedrock of everyday life, trade and economy. The Viking presence, initially driven by plunder, rapidly evolved into a sophisticated network of commerce that revitalized and reshaped existing economic structures. Consider the strategic importance of Jorvik itself. It wasn't just a military capital, it became a nexus for long-distance trade, connecting the Baltic regions, Ireland, and continental Europe with the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. Viking traders, with their extensive networks and their longships capable of navigating treacherous waters, introduced a level of commercial dynamism that had been somewhat fragmented under earlier Anglo-Saxon rule. They brought with them not only goods but also a more standardized approach to trade, including the use of silver as a primary medium of exchange, often in the form of hack silver, pieces of silver cut from larger ingots or objects, allowing for flexible denominations. This facilitated a more fluid and accessible marketplace. Furthermore, the Viking emphasis on maritime trade led to the development and expansion of port towns and coastal settlements. These became hubs where goods were exchanged, fortunes were made, and cultural diffusion occurred organically. The introduction of new crafts and technologies, from improved metalworking techniques to more efficient shipbuilding, also had a significant economic impact. While Anglo-Saxon England had its own established crafts, the Vikings brought with them a different set of skills and an insatiable demand for certain raw materials and finished goods, stimulating local production and innovation. Now picture the bustling markets of Jorvik, a cacophony of languages, the clatter of goods being unloaded, the exchange of coins and hack silver, the aroma of exotic spices mingling with the scent of cured hides and freshly forged metal. This was the economic engine of the Danelaw, a testament to the Vikings' commercial acumen. Conversely, this economic integration was not without its complexities. The Anglo-Saxon populations often found themselves in a subordinate economic position, subject to Viking tribute and trade regulations. However, the sheer volume and dynamism of Viking-driven commerce also offered opportunities for those who could adapt. Anglo-Saxon farmers and craftsmen, by supplying goods for the burgeoning trade networks, could also benefit from the increased demand. This created a complex economic relationship, one characterized by both exploitation and mutual benefit, a far cry from the simplistic narrative of pure conquest. The economic restructuring driven by the Vikings thus laid some of the groundwork for the eventual emergence of a more unified English economy, one that would carry the indelible imprint of its Scandinavian past. The legal and administrative frameworks established by the Vikings in the Danelaw were not simply imposed wholesale. They represented a pragmatic fusion, a testament to the Vikings' adaptability in governing diverse populations. Beyond the public assemblies, the very concept of justice underwent a subtle yet significant evolution. Anglo-Saxon law, while codified, often relied on oaths and compurgation, groups of oath helpers who would swear to a defendant's good character. The Vikings, however, brought with them a more direct approach to evidence and accountability, often emphasizing tangible proofs and witness testimony. Consider the implications for property disputes, a common source of conflict. While Anglo-Saxon custom might have relied heavily on sworn attestations of ownership, Viking law increasingly incorporated the examination of deeds, boundary markers, and the testimony of those who had witnessed transactions or held land over time. This shift, though seemingly minor, represented a move towards a more empirical, less faith-based system of justice, laying foundational elements for the later development of English common law. Furthermore, the administrative machinery required to manage these diverse territories necessitated a re-evaluation of record-keeping and communication. While the Saxons had scribes and a tradition of written records, the scale of Viking operations, spanning vast distances and encompassing multiple settlements, demanded a more robust and standardized system. This led to the increased use of written charters and writs, often drafted in a hybrid form of Old English and Norse, detailing land grants, legal judgments, and agreements. Now, visualize the local reeve, an Anglo-Saxon official, working alongside a Viking scribe, meticulously documenting land boundaries and tax obligations for both Saxon and Norse settlers. This collaborative effort, born out of administrative necessity, gradually blurred the lines between the two legal traditions, creating a unique Anglo-Norse jurisprudence. This wasn't merely about translation. It was about integrating different legal philosophies into a functional system that could maintain order and facilitate the smooth operation of the Danelaw. Another crucial layer in this administrative restructuring was the Viking approach to taxation and tribute. While Anglo-Saxon kingdoms levied taxes, the Vikings often implemented a more systematic and rigorous system, designed to extract resources efficiently to fund their ongoing military campaigns and to maintain their ruling elite. This involved detailed surveys of land and resources, establishing clear obligations for both Anglo-Saxon and Norse populations. The collection of herregeld, a form of tribute or payment to the army, became a pervasive feature of life in the Danelaw, influencing agricultural practices and trade patterns as communities strove to meet these demands. This economic pressure, while burdensome, also fostered a degree of administrative coherence, as the need to collect and account for these payments necessitated a more organized and centralized approach to resource management across disparate regions. Conversely, the Vikings' engagement with established Anglo-Saxon institutions was not always a matter of outright replacement. In many instances, they adapted and incorporated existing structures to serve their own ends. For example, the Anglo-Saxon shire system, a well-established administrative division, was often retained, with Viking earls or jarls taking over the oversight of these regions. This pragmatic approach allowed the Vikings to leverage existing knowledge of the land and its inhabitants, rather than attempting to build an entirely new administrative apparatus from scratch. It was a strategy of assimilation through adaptation, where the framework of Anglo-Saxon governance provided a ready-made structure upon which Viking authority could be layered, ensuring a degree of continuity while firmly establishing their dominion. This intricate interplay between imposed authority and adapted tradition formed the complex administrative and legal fabric of the Danelaw, a testament to the Vikings' sophisticated approach to governance. Reflecting on this journey through the crucible of ancient conflict, we find ourselves at a unique vantage point. The echoes of clashing steel and strategic maneuvers have coalesced, not into a simple recounting of events, but into a profound contemplation of forces that shape human endeavor. The very fabric of warfare, once seemingly defined by brute strength and unwavering formations, has been revealed to possess a deeper, more intricate architecture. We have witnessed how ingrained traditions, while offering a semblance of impregnable defense, can also harbor unseen vulnerabilities, subtle fissures waiting to be exploited by a keen and adaptive mind. The narrative has shifted from the singular impact of a weapon to the nuanced interplay of human psychology, tactical innovation, and the ever-present currents of cultural exchange. As we pivot towards the final reflection, it becomes evident that the threads we have meticulously examined, the disciplined might of the shieldwall, the calculated audacity of the Viking response, the intricate dance of societal integration, and the enduring legacy of transformed landscapes and languages, are not disparate elements. Instead, they converge to illuminate a singular, potent truth about the nature of conflict and its lasting reverberations. Consider it akin to observing the convergence of several rivers. Each retains its individual character, yet their union creates a force, a depth, and a breadth that transcends the sum of their parts, shaping the terrain in ways none could have achieved alone. This confluence points not merely to a historical outcome, but to an enduring principle that resonates across the ages. a principle that speaks to the perpetual evolution of human strategy and the profound, often unexpected ways in which societies are forged and transformed. The journey thus far has laid the groundwork, revealing the intricate mechanisms at play, and now, we prepare to grasp the ultimate significance of these interwoven narratives. The story of Eoforwick, and indeed the broader saga of Viking dominance, is far more than a chronicle of battles and territorial shifts. It is a profound testament to the dynamic, ever-evolving nature of human ingenuity and the inexorable force of adaptation. We have seen how the seemingly unshakable Saxon shieldwall, a symbol of tradition and disciplined might, was ultimately undone not by a single overwhelming blow, but by a calculated dismantling, a masterful exploitation of its inherent rigidity. This was not simply a victory of brute force, but a triumph of strategic foresight, a demonstration that true power often lies not in the strength of one's defenses, but in the agility of one's offense and the keenness of one's understanding of the adversary. The Vikings, emerging from the harsh landscapes of the north, brought with them not just axes and spears, but a revolutionary approach to warfare, one that prioritized deception, flanking maneuvers, and a deep psychological understanding of their opponents. This profound lesson in adaptability resonates far beyond the blood-soaked fields of the past. It speaks to the fundamental truth that stagnation, however comfortable or deeply ingrained in tradition, inevitably leads to vulnerability. The Saxons, masters of their established art of war, found themselves outmaneuvered by a force that refused to be confined by convention. Their reliance on the static, the predictable, became their undoing when confronted by an enemy who understood that true strength lies in fluidity, in the ability to shift and adapt, to probe and exploit. This narrative is a powerful reminder that the most formidable fortresses are not always those built of stone, but those constructed from an unwavering commitment to innovation and a willingness to question the efficacy of even the most time-honored methods. The enduring legacy of this era, etched into the very language, legal systems, and landscape of England, underscores the transformative power of cultural confluence born from conflict. It reveals that even in the face of profound disruption, a new synthesis can emerge, a richer tapestry woven from the threads of disparate traditions. The echoes of Jorvik and the Danelaw are not merely historical footnotes. They are living testaments to the fact that societies, like armies, must constantly evolve to survive and thrive. The true practice begins now, to recognize the echoes of this ancient struggle in our own lives, to embrace adaptability, and to understand that the most enduring strength lies not in clinging to the past, but in forging a future shaped by relentless innovation and a deep understanding of the ever-shifting currents of change.